The bomb comes through the flight deck faster than anyone can react, and by the time the men on the hangar deck below register the sound, it is already among them. They are standing in a long steel cavern, packed wingtip to wingtip with aircraft. Every plane fueled, most of them armed, fuel lines still run out across the deck, bombs stacked in the open because there was no time to strike them back down into the magazines. One explosion becomes a dozen. The fuel vapor that has been collecting in the enclosed space with nowhere to vent catches all at once, and the hangar turns into the inside of a furnace. And here is the part that defined service on a Japanese carrier. There is nowhere for the fire to go. It is sealed inside the ship. And so are the men. To understand why so many of them died like this, you have to understand what a Japanese aircraft carrier actually was. A magnificent, aggressive, and quietly terrifying machine that was built to deliver a knockout blow and was never seriously built to survive being hit. The Imperial Japanese Navy built its carriers around a single idea: strike first, strike hardest, and end the fight before the enemy could answer. Everything about the design served the offensive. These ships carried powerful air groups, launched fast, and could range across the Pacific with the fleet. In the opening months of the war, that philosophy worked so completely that it seemed like proof the Japanese had solved carrier warfare before anyone else. But offense has a cost, and on a Japanese carrier, the crew paid it. Start with the hangars. American carriers used open-sided hangar decks, great galleries with roll-up shutters that could be thrown open to the sea. If a fire broke out, the heat and fuel vapor could vent overboard, and burning aircraft could be pushed straight off the side. Japanese carriers were built the opposite way. Their hangars were fully enclosed within the hull, stacked 2 levels deep, sealed steel boxes with no open sides at all. It made the ship cleaner, faster, and better protected against the weather. It also meant that when aviation fuel spilled and vaporized inside that box, the fumes had nowhere to disperse. They pooled. They waited. And a single spark could turn the entire enclosed volume into a bomb. Now add what the ship was carrying. Beneath the crew's feet sat tens of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, high-octane, volatile, and stored in tanks that on some ships were built directly into the hull structure, so that a hard blow anywhere near them could crack seams and let the vapor seep out into the ship. Add to that the ordnance, bombs and torpedoes, moved by hand, stacked and restacked as attack orders changed. Every man aboard a carrier lived, ate, and slept on top of the 2 most dangerous things in naval warfare: fuel and explosives, separated from catastrophe by nothing but discipline and luck. A Japanese carrier was, in the most literal sense, a floating bomb that its own crew had to live inside. Midway, in June 1942, showed the whole world what that meant. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were caught at the worst possible moment, their hangar decks crowded with aircraft in the middle of being rearmed and refueled as the crews raced to switch ordnance for a change of targets. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Bombs that had been swapped out lay stacked in the open instead of stored safely below because there was simply no time. It was the single most vulnerable state a carrier can be in. Then the American dive bombers arrived. The bombs that hit did not have to sink those ships by brute force. They only had to reach the hangars and start the fire that the ships themselves would finish. Fuel ignited fuel. Bombs cooked off in chains. The fires fed on the aviation gasoline sealed inside the hangar boxes and became uncontrollable within minutes. 3 carriers were mortally wounded almost at once. A 4th followed later the same day. The pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was gone in an afternoon, not because the ships were weak, but because the very features that made them lethal made them almost impossible to save once the fire got in. For the men below decks, it was the nightmare they had always half known was coming. In the engine rooms and boiler spaces deep in the hull, sailors felt the ship shudder and heard the roar travel through the steel, and understood that the only routes up and out led through fire. Many never received an order to abandon their stations because the men who would have given it were already dead, or because the voice pipes and telephones had burned. They stayed at their posts in the heat and the dark and the rising smoke, holding a ship that was killing them. But you did not need a battle to be afraid on a Japanese carrier. The fear was built into ordinary life aboard. Below the flight deck, the ship was a maze of cramped steel compartments, and the deeper you worked, the worse it got. In the engineering spaces, temperatures climbed brutally high, the air thick with the smell of oil and hot metal, the noise of the machinery constant enough that men learned to read one another's lips. Ventilation in the lower decks was poor by any modern standard, and in the tropical Pacific, the heat pressed down on everything. The steel bulkheads too hot to lean against, the bedding never dry. Men worked long watches soaked through, in compartments far below the waterline, moving through a warren of hatches and ladders they had memorized precisely because they knew, in the dark part of the mind, exactly how far they were from daylight if something went wrong. A carrier's crew could number in the thousands, and in an emergency, every one of them was trying to climb the same few ladders toward the same distant sky. And everyone aboard understood the arithmetic of the enclosed hangar. A single careless moment during fueling, a spark, a leak, a spilled drum, could kill hundreds without an enemy anywhere near. The crews drilled constantly against fire, but the drills were a reminder as much as a defense. You cannot spend months living directly above a lake of aviation fuel without the knowledge settling somewhere in the back of your mind and staying there. The other thing the crews lived with was a damage control system that was simply not built to the same standard as their enemies. The American Navy poured enormous effort into saving wounded ships, trained damage control parties, fuel lines that could be drained and flooded with inert gas to keep them from exploding, foam and firefighting gear distributed throughout the hull. The Japanese Navy, its doctrine fixed on attack, invested far less in the unglamorous work of not sinking. Fewer men were trained for it, the equipment was thinner, and the fuel systems that should have been purged and made inert after flight operations too often were not. When fire came, the crew fought it with courage and lost, again and again, to problems that had been designed into the ship years before they ever came aboard. The war's later years turned the fear into something almost surgical in its cruelty. In the summer of 1944, the brand new carrier Taihō, the most heavily armored flight deck Japan had ever built, a ship meant to be nearly unsinkable, took a single torpedo hit during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The damage seemed survivable, but the hit had cracked her aviation fuel system, and gasoline vapor began seeping through the ship. Hours passed. In an effort to clear the fumes, the crew ran the ventilation system at full power, and instead of removing the vapor, they spread it into every corner of the hull. When it finally found a spark, the explosion tore the great armored carrier apart from the inside. The ship that was built to take punishment was destroyed by her own fuel and a well-meaning attempt to make her safe. A few months later, the enormous Shinano, the largest carrier in the world, was sunk on her maiden voyage by a single American submarine, her watertight compartments unfinished, her crew barely trained, her damage control unequal to the flooding. She went down before she had ever launched an aircraft in anger. These were not weak ships crewed by weak men. They were powerful ships whose greatest dangers came from within, and the men inside them knew it. There is a particular weight to serving aboard a vessel whose strengths and whose deadliest weaknesses are the same thing. The features that let a Japanese carrier hit like a hammer, the packed, enclosed hangars, the vast stores of fuel, the emphasis on offense over survival, were the exact features most likely to kill the crew when the ship's luck ran out. Every man who walked those hangar decks was living inside that contradiction, and most of them understood it. They kept their stations anyway. In the boiler rooms and the magazines, on the hangar decks slick with fuel, they did their work above the fire that was always waiting one spark away. And when it finally came for so many of them, it came fast, and it came from beneath their own feet, from the very ship they had trusted to carry them home. They served on the sharpest sword the Imperial Navy ever forged, and lived every day on top of the reason it could break. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.